Currently, 26-year-old Marshall Iwasa is taking a drive to see his mother. He has just spent the day doing chores around his home in Calgary. His trip comes at a time where he's currently on break from college. But he has yet to inform members of his family. Perhaps he just wasn't ready to tell his family he needed a semester off. Or answer, as he continued his 2-hour trip towards Lethbridge. But after his arrival and a short visit with his mother to help her with her computer, at around 11 p.m., Marshall would be set to hit the road again. You see, the other reason that Marshall came plan was to take a quick trip to this storage facility located in the industrial park of Lethbridge. Then after this quick errand, it would be a straight shot back to Kent and set up school and back to business as usual for Marshall. But unbeknownst to his family, Marshall had stopped attending classes some time ago. This is the Felix Creek Trail in Pemberton, British Columbia, the Brian Waddington Hut. This location is maintained by a volunteer outdoor club which allows individuals to spend the night up there, assuming they register online. The trail itself is well off the beaten path, so much so that it's often cited as a location where you're not likely to run into anybody, especially if nobody was scheduled to be up there. But on November 23rd, 2019, one post would signify a rather dark discovery, where James M. Stark would write, "Had a crazy experience this weekend trying to get to the Brian Waddington Hut. We took the 4x4 trail all the way to the trailhead, and when we arrived, we came onto quite the scene. There was a burnt-out pickup truck that smelled very fresh. In addition, there were ID cards, toiletry bags, and clothing. It felt like a crime scene, and we had a very eerie feeling. We turned around and left, decided police, and reported it. I thought the community would like to know before anyone drives 4 hours to a trailhead only to be turned around." This truck was Marshall's. It had been found in a matter of days. A staggering 14-hour car was completely torched. The steering column was removed. But Marshall was nowhere to be found. Meaning whoever did this drove the car as far as they possibly could into the woods. Of the items that were found at the scene, this included a large amount of clothes, ID cards, 2 passports, 3 smashed cell phones, and a smashed laptop that all belonged to Marshall. But that being said, not all of the items were his. While there's been a number of videos on Marshall's disappearance, there's a thread of this story that often gets overlooked. And the thread I'm referencing in this case is a separate rabbit hole of information that seemingly ties Marshall's case to another missing persons case from this time. This other individual I'm referring to is Daniel Riak. He disappeared under equally bizarre circumstances just 3 days after Marshall's truck was found. Since then, family members of Daniel's have identified a wide array of work items found at Marshall's truck as belonging to Daniel. And in an even more recent development, it seemingly confirms the connection. But that being said, we'll circle back to his case here in a moment. Because in regards to the original discovery, by the time the RCMP had reached the scene, It appears as if someone had tampered with the evidence.
We have a bunch of items that used to be in the box that are now spread out, broken, and it looks like water ice poured on it. Things are strategically placed or broken. Some of it's just completely removed.
This, again, is a very remote area. It was very difficult for us to get there. So it's difficult to think that in that small window of 2 days when our hikers that took the photos were leaving, that someone new who wasn't involved with Marshall's disappearance happened to go up there and move these items. And our hikers that took the photos, they've never mentioned seeing anyone there. We've never seen any logs of anyone being out there.
As fate would have it, it seems that Marshall never seemingly returned to Calgary. While it would take some time before the family was notified of the situation, upon checking back in with the storage facility, it was revealed that after Marshall had left his mother's home, he seemingly spent the entirety of the night trying to get into his storage unit. But there was a problem. The facility was closed. While the actual surveillance footage was deleted by the time the family had been notified, keypad records had shown that Marshall had input his access code various times over the night unsuccessfully. But it appears that Marshall had waited there throughout the entirety of the night until he successfully gained entry at around 6 a.m. After getting into his unit, he would go on to spend 2.5 hours inside until he left at 8:24 a.m. After this exact point, there's no further details about his whereabouts. His financial trail goes cold, storage unit so desperately.
Yeah, okay, so do you know why he was in the storage room?
So he needed a box for a piece of his computer. So he built his own computer. He was a computer guy. That's what he was originally going to school for. And he needed to send a piece away because his computer was broken. So he was looking for something to do with his computer.
Okay,
Yeah.
and he was in there for 2 hours.
Yes.
Okay, and I guess that's normal. I don't know. I mean, especially if you haven't been back to your storage room in a long time and if it's really full.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was last there in August. So it's not like he was there all the time. But yeah, since then, the storage unit has been searched and nothing is weird about it. Everything seems normal. Everything is still there.
While Marshall's family insisted, the first of which was that Marshall had spent about 800 hours developing a video game, and from what I can assume are backup timestamps, it appears that he had been working on the game the morning of, prior to heading to his mother's. Given this detail that he was working on a passion project, I can see how this would create some urgency to retrieve whatever part was necessary. But on the other hand, the other thing I should point out is that Marshall had seemingly packed a bag at some point. With all of the clothes and toiletries found at the scene, this seems to insinuate some sort of planned trip after the fact, as Marshall was known to keep his trunk rather organized. Additionally, there were quite a few items that were never located, one of which was his hiking backpack, which seems to strengthen this idea that there was a packed bag in his car. But that being said, even if Marshall had been planning a secret trip after this visit to the storage facility, undoubtedly strange. Generally speaking, finding a car burned off an old logging road is not a unique set of circumstances. It's actually a pretty textbook method of disposal, as in column, in cases where extra precaution is taken, as in some cases, DNA swabbed from a steering wheel has led to various convictions.
In the Bienville National Forest, a body found inside a burned out car. This burned out car you see here during a worker's early morning walk.
Yavapai County Sheriff's Office investigating a suspicious death after a body was found in a burned out car.
A man's body and a burned out car found near a construction site close to Grand Avenue.
Deputies say the car was found on a logging road off Highway 155 near Montevallo. Body was found burned in Pike Township in a wooded area near Eagle Creek.
A body found inside a burned car.
Around 9:45 last night, just beyond those pine trees is Interstate 40.
I think you get the point. This phenomenon is not just common, it's shockingly common. And the reason I bring this up in regards to Marshall's case is because of what happens next. Because after the RCMP had gotten involved in the following, that being a path of burned clothes that started from the car and led to a nearby creek, where it, quote, appeared as if someone had caught on fire while the vehicle was burning. A subsequent underwater search had revealed nothing, however, and further efforts to locate Marshall were suspended, leading to a final statement given by police.
We believe that he was likely the driver. There's some personal effects around in the area, but there's nothing to suggest that there was anything.
Now, let's recap for a moment. A young man is missing. His car is found 14 hours away at the end of a remote logging road in an area he's not known to have ties to. His car is burned to an absolute crisp. His steering column is removed. There are items at the scene that aren't his. It appears as if someone had tampered with the scene after its discovery. And there's a trail of burned clothes neatly tied up by saying nothing suspicious had occurred. The mere insinuation that he did this on his own accord is absolutely ridiculous, especially when you factor in that Marshall had just recently paid off his truck. Yet, when push came to shove, and the initial search was called off within the first week of December, the Whistler RCMP would go on to insinuate that he just simply walked off into the woods. But come December 12th, 2019, the case, despite new leadership, they would once again refuse to acknowledge any possibility of foul play, and instead would go on to cite Marshall's recent failure to attend college classes as evidence that he had become withdrawn. As a consequence of the authorities' refusal to classify this case as criminal, no forensic tests were ever carried out. And after the RCMP had collected the loose items found at the scene, they simply just left the car. But after the LPD had done a final search in June of 2020, the case would take a rather strange turn. After the case is criminal. You see, given the fact that this case was technically a missing persons case, this created a bunch of red tape preventing the full pursuit of this investigation. And one potential lead that wasn't able to be fully investigated was the search for gas station CCTV footage. We know for a fact that Marshall would have had to stop for gas multiple times, and while Marshall's family did check the various on their own accord. But beyond that, additional frustration could be felt for the police not even allowing the family to view the items that were found. To date, we're only left with the various photos that surfaced online.
When Cassie was here, there was a lot of barriers with the Missing Persons Act in trying to get historical data of Marshall's movements. You know, and for me, one of the biggest things would be this fire investigation that, just happened.
And no results yet, right?
yeah, from what I've been told, they're still waiting on the fire investigator report, which is a month now, just over a month from when they were up there. And you're up there since day one. Yeah. And for them to just have one, I mean, I'm happy that one went up there when they did the final search that they just completed. But, it's a little bit late and we're still waiting for that report. Because, if it's considered arson.
Seems really strange that they would wait that long with evidence, right?
And that was our concern from the beginning of having the trucks still being out there, is that it wasn't a controlled site.
This fire investigation would later be deemed inconclusive, which would bar Marshall's case from a criminal classification. And as you can imagine, leaving the car to the elements for 9 months definitely didn't help for clarity. But that being said, when the family hired a private investigator, his findings differed on the site. But despite these findings, this didn't appear to shake the LPD's opinion on the case, and come August of 2020, the family would launch a petition to manually push the case to a criminal classification. Shortly after the petition was statement. The Lethbridge Police Service understands the family of Marshall Iwasa is seeking answers in relation to his disappearance, and we can assure the community the investigation will remain open and ongoing until he's located. A thorough and comprehensive investigation has been undertaken, and any and all new evidence or information that comes to light in the future will continue to be vigorously pursued. Iwasa, who was 26 years old at the time he was reported missing, was last seen by his relatives in Lethbridge on November 17, 2019. He told family he was returning to Calgary, but hasn't been seen or heard from since. He was reported from the onset of the missing persons investigation. Iwasa's disappearance has been considered suspicious. However, as previously stated, there is no credible, corroborated, or compelling evidence to suggest foul play or that the matter is criminal in nature. Not all information and evidence in this case has been an online petition initiated by the Iwasa family to have the missing person case classified as criminal. However, in order for any investigation to be deemed criminal, there must be such evidence and the matter cannot be reclassified at this time. No further comment or interviews will be provided in relation to this matter. Quick to call out some perceived contradictions. First of all, it appears rather inaccurate for police to claim that they considered this case suspicious from the beginning, when we know for a fact that the RCMP initially stated that, quote, nothing suspicious had occurred and then promptly closed the case, holding a case against the suspect. Yet despite this case being declared non-criminal, information is still being withheld at the expense of the family, which seems paradoxical given the circumstances. Additionally, members of Marshall's family have given statements that downplay the possibility of an investigation going on behind the scenes, instead insisting that they just never took his case seriously from the start. Because despite various new leads for this case coming in the coming months, the LPD would continue to ignore it. Foul play or not, arson is still a crime. And given these circumstances, it definitely makes you wonder. And this question only becomes more prominent as you dive into the second thread of this story. On the very same day that the police had reached the scene of Marshall's truck, another set of... At 10 a.m., 29-year-old Daniel Rioch had been reported walking around Chikai Ranch in Upper... He wasn't dressed for the weather, and at one point, the rancher had apparently spotted Danny walking in the street with his shirt on, where he would go on to make a call to his uncle.
And so Danny takes the phone and he's like, hey, uncle, how are you doing? I'm lying right now. That's what he said. My dad was like, okay. And then he started laughing again. He was like, yeah, I love you, unc. And then he could hear the man in the background saying, oh, I need my phone back. So the ranch owner took the phone back and then was on after.
As a result of Daniel's strange behavior, he was taken into police custody for the day, but they inevitably released him at 5 p.m. as they had no reason to hold him. At 6 p.m., Daniel by Walmart. 15 minutes later, he would return to Tim Hortons once again, where he'd get a ride back to the Chikai Ranch area towards the Squamish Indian Reservation where his family was located. Then later that evening at 1 a.m., Daniel would be last seen by his Aunt Katrina walking off the back deck towards... As the last person to see him, she recounted that he had woken her up and told her that he had been fighting with a friend down by the river. At the time, she wrote the strange behavior off as him being intoxicated. But later that night, Daniel's car would be found idling with the lights on, where Daniel was nowhere to be found. It appeared as if Daniel had just stepped out of his car for a moment, as his cell phone was reported to be inside. By the next morning, another family member had reported Daniel's vehicle as abandoned, where it would be towed and placed into the hands of the RCMP. But despite discovering this car in the state, no one on the reservation sounded the alarm and actually reported him missing. As the holiday season came and went, it wouldn't be until January 7th, 2020, 6 weeks later, that Daniel would be filed as a missing person.
So there was a space between the last time my wife Deb and I talked to him on November 25th and January 7th, and that was a little bit disconcerting to us because nobody noticed that he was missing, even though he was living in a very, very small community. It was a little bit quiet on that front. As soon as we made the RCMP missing persons report, everybody...
Filed by Daniel's great uncle, who did not live on the reservation, the police would go on to solicit some general details about his disappearance to the public. But despite these efforts, and to best understand Daniel's situation, I should state for a bit of context that Daniel had a pretty rough upbringing. He was an indigenous First Squamish Nations male who grew up without either parents. His dad was never in the picture, and his mother was a working girl who had him at the age of 14. April Rioch, his mother, had been featured in a popular Canadian documentary called Through a Blue Lens. Produced by the National Film Board of Canada and released in 1999, it explored the world of addiction through troubled individuals in Vancouver's downtown east side.
Well, I hope to see myself, with my son in Squamish, or at least far away from, I don't even have to be, I can be next door from downtown, but at least far away in my mind.
A year after the film premiered, April was tragically found deceased in an alley on Christmas Day. Displaced Daniel from the last of his nuclear family. And even leading up to Daniel's disappearance, he had seemingly been struggling himself. But that being said, Daniel had reportedly been making attempts to get his life back on track for the sake of his children. You see, Daniel was also a father. He was recently divorced, but when things were going well for him, he had steady work as a laborer for various companies. But despite Daniel's struggles, there's still a lot to consider when it comes to his disappearance. Claimed people were out to get him, and he had multiple episodes that his family just weren't sure what to make of.
He sort of went through he was going to bring him down to North Vancouver for an operation on his hand, and he ended up going in the hospital, but then he called my dad back shortly after and said, "Oh, I'm not having the surgery," or something like that. And he ended up, my dad picked him up and said, "What's going on?" He goes, "Oh, I'm not having the surgery," or something like that. My dad was really confused by it. And then he just started going through a really weird period. Still, was pretty happy. Like, he was pretty happy.
One instance, he left his rental in Squamish, took a bus to Winnipeg, broke into a local cabin, then turned himself into police. After being... Additionally, in another strange set of circumstances, his uncle had discovered his kitchen door kicked open, with Daniel dazed and confused as to what was going on.
He had just kind of, had some sort of break or was on. My dad, we were starting to suspect that he was on, but we weren't totally sure. And he had broken into the next door neighbor's house as well, too. He had broken in and was trying to find, like he was trying to find, I think, because his old best friend used to live next door, so it was, I think he was stuck maybe in the past or something like that. Like he was thinking he was going to find his friend, and then he was going to, you know, he wasn't sure why my dad wasn't answering the door. I don't know exactly. But my dad ended up having to call the police and say, like, this has happened and I don't know what's going on, and he just seems really out of it. So the police took.
Daniel himself had claimed that he experienced some form of psychosis as a result. But obviously, evaluating the actions of an individual with bouts of irrational behavior is undeniably challenging when it comes to analyzing on in his life. In one instance, Daniel told his uncle Rob that he needed to go to the hospital as a result of breaking his hand from punching a door. But over time, it was of individuals, and he had been beaten up. This caused him to apparently go into hiding for quite some time, leading to him fleeing to a recovery center in Surrey, Canada. The only detail I was able to find here was that this hammer incident was allegedly in relation to something Danny had stolen, or why. But here's where this gets rather interesting. Recall this earlier screenshot from Daniel's ex-wife. She also highlighted that around this same time, a thread regarding Marshall Iwasa's burnt truck, stating that they recognized various items at the scene as being Daniel's, but then later stated they didn't want to give out any additional information for their own personal safety. And within the same thread, they would go on to claim that they needed to have a private family meeting to discuss the nature of this case, before these comments were screenshotted by a member of Marshall's Facebook group. But after reaching out to Marshall's family about this particular thread, they are aware of this case potentially tying into Daniel Rioch, and based on my messages to Dawson, Marshall's brother-in-law, the bar that was found at Marshall's truck, which has been alleged by various members in the Facebook community to bear the name Cody Lewis. And on that note, to date, this is the first time this photo has ever been shared publicly, which seems to confirm the aforementioned. Now, this unreleased photo was provided to me by a member of Marshall's family, and initially this detail about the cooler wasn't known publicly to either family at all. The only reason this became public knowledge was because it was effectively leaked from an off-the-record statement by an RCMP officer to a witness who later would go on to post about it online. According to Dawson, the RCMP couldn't figure out who this that lives in the reservation. Within articles pertaining to the search for Daniel Rioch, it states the Lewis family is the one spearheading it. Daniel also coincidentally appears to have a cousin named Cody Lewis. To Daniel. While one relative also seems to share a name with an item found at the scene, that a cousin's cooler could have come into his possession. But while this is speculation, once again, law enforcement allegedly could not figure out who this Cody Lewis was. And it seems that the official stance is that there is nothing to see here. But if this cooler doesn't have any relation to Daniel Rioch, the question then becomes, who was this other Cody Lewis? In either situation, this photo proves that police prevented the family from viewing all the items that were found, and this makes for a very questionable bit of police work. But nonetheless, the link between a few months into 2020, the RCMP would be notified of one additional lead, where an eyewitness would go on to claim to have seen both of the missing men at one particular location back in November prior to their disappearances. The location is a bar called That Irish Place in Squamish, British Columbia. The witness is a local. According to the witness, the third man appeared to have power over what appeared to be Marshall and Daniel, where reportedly they were both noted to be somewhat distressed. After all of them had sat down for a beer at the bar, the witness would have a brief yet disturbing conversation with Daniel over a smoke, where shortly after, Daniel would be further observed heading back to the truck with the others. Notably, the witness would observe the truck idling in the parking lot for quite some time. And to quote the man directly, I have a now deleted Facebook post that was in response to Daniel's second cousin, Sonia. Sonia, I'm very sure it was Marshall's truck in the parking lot outside of That Irish Place in November of 2019. Marshall, Daniel, and the quote, scary dude were sitting in it for a couple hours. After the three of them, Daniel said, I think that guy's going to kill us. I did not take him serious and butted out my cigarette and went back inside. The bank machine was 10 feet from my bar stool and Marshall came in by himself and tried to get money. I sensed some distress from him and almost asked him if he was okay because I would have given him $20. He tried the machine 3 times without success, then went back out to the truck and got into the passenger's side. The truck had Alberta plates on it. When I gave the RCMP an audio statement in March or April, after the statement, off the record, the officer asked me if I knew Cody Lewis. I told him I did, and asked why. He said Cody Lewis was written on the lid's picture. I remembered him at the bank machine. I am 100% positive the 2 cases are linked. Now, mentioning that this witness was a local, where he claimed to know of Daniel before this encounter. And it certainly does at least add to the credibility given the fact that they were later proven correct regarding the cooler detail. But beyond that, on an even more strange, Daniel had left his guitar with the bartender, where in the coming days after his disappearance, the witness had also noticed that the police had come in to pick up the guitar as well, meaning that shortly after Daniel disappeared, police had in their possession his car, which also contained his phone, and his guitar. Yet this also in no way caused any alarm to sound for his whereabouts. Now, it goes without saying that there are a lot of unknowns in regards to this case. We don't have the full story when it comes to what transpired at the storage unit, and we don't even seem to remotely have a full picture on how this truck ended up where it did. But when it comes to things like the truck site, on one hand you have obvious hints of someone trying to conceal evidence with a fire, but then it seems like they also didn't get to quite finish what they started, with piles of loose items thrown about. It's almost as if the party responsible was interrupted, which could very well explain that weird trail of burned clothes leading to a body of water. There's also this additional unknown in regards to who or what tampered with the site after its discovery, while Isaac's fears about running into someone and then this happening. Continuing on, however, if you were to take a look at much of the discussion online in regards to these 2 cases on places like Web Sleuths or Reddit, a pretty persistent theory is that these 2 were potentially involved in some sort of illegal trade. One thing that seems to support this idea was the fact that Marshall had just recently paid off his truck, but his family could not account for what he'd been doing for work. You see, something that many people forget is the fact that storage units are often a hotspot for storing substances. They are often seen as a neutral territory because everything's under surveillance, and things can still be moved to and from as long as they're disguised. When it comes to the transport of these items over long distances, usually you see some sort of concealment device to remain inconspicuous if the person gets pulled over. Notably, hollowed-out electronics are a pretty common concealment device, and both a hollowed-out Xbox shell and PlayStation shell was found in Marshall's truck. Additionally, I should also point out that coolers are often another common concealment device, usually in the lining of the cooler. Now, as far as the smashed electronics go, the family has given some clarifying statements.
So there was also a laptop that was found out around his vehicle, right? Was it in good enough shape to be analyzed?
They gave us information that the police had looked into it. It hadn't been used for a while, like a few years. And I think from the timeline of it, I had thought that maybe it was one that we'd given him a long time ago.
Okay.
And my understanding of that laptop too is that it had fallen and got broken.
Okay. Even before it was found outside of the truck?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And the thing with some of those phones too is I know that there was articles that they were like smashed or broken, and that also wouldn't surprise me if those were the phones that Marshall had broken and had just left in his truck.
Beyond that, I should state that the police work on this case is a bit of a mystery, and in and of itself, I'm not sure what to make of it. Assuming we're sticking with the initial theory that the two men were involved in some sort of running, you may view the actions from the beginning as a tactic used to not spook a greater inquiry into organized crime. But if that were the case, you wouldn't expect this back and forth between the family and the authorities. Marshall's family claims there's been no such follow-through and that authorities have dragged their feet and ignored key towards the idea of a hidden inquiry. It seems to suggest the mishandling of a case. Marshall's brother-in-law explained to me that the reason they never released the cooler photo was that there was, for a time, the impression that this side of the story was being looked into. But over time, it seems that opinion was shifted. While this is obviously my attempt to piece together the available information, at the end of the day, two men are still missing. A car is still sitting in the woods, and both families are still without any answers. While obviously I'd love to know what you guys think about all of this, this is Barely Sociable, and have a good night. Today's video is brought to you by Audible. Now, if there's something that I've started to do more and more when it comes to making videos online, it's that I've started to make more of an effort to write the script for my video in a way that you don't miss any key details just by listening. And based on this poll I did a while back, about 69% of you prefer to listen to videos over watching them. And if you're someone who likes consuming content in this way, then you'll probably like today's sponsor, Audible, the go-to service when it comes to audiobooks. Titles that I'm a fan of or I've used in part for research include The following excerpt was written by Harold William Tillman, a legendary explorer who led an expedition to Heard Island in 1964. Heard Island, in latitude 53 degrees 10 minutes south, longitude 73 degrees 35 minutes east, is an uninhabited subantarctic island lying about 300 miles to the southeast of the much larger island Kerguelen. Measuring only some 23 miles by 12 miles, it culminates in the peak known as Big Ben, which is 9,005 feet high. Thus, the island is nearly all mountain, a mountain heavily glaciated on all sides. Many of the glaciers terminate in ice cliffs that are washed by the sea. As far back as 1957, I had an eye to Big Ben, but inquiries shown that there was no safe anchorage where mischief could be left. A letter, too, from Mr. P.G. Law, then and now director of the Australian Antarctic Division, had been discouraging. As regards your getting to Heard Island, he had written, "I cannot overstress the dangers which will face you if you proceed in a small boat. As you know, Heard Island is right in the track of the Great Westerly Cyclones, which sweep across the Southern Ocean, with almost no intervening period of good weather of any duration. The seas are mountainous, and altogether I can think of no worse place to sail a small craft. Now, Tillman would captain a ship called the Patinella for this particular expedition. While Mischief was his usual ship, he didn't dare take it to this place. And due to his efforts, they were later successful in reaching the summit of this remote and desolate place. As a result of this being the first time that Big Ben had been summited, it was an achievement heard across the globe. But what nobody knew at the time was that Tillman would later disappear at sea some 13 years later, with not a trace of him being found since. At the age of 79, he had been attempting to lead a similar world-first expedition to Mount Foster in the Antarctic. But after the ship had left port in Rio de Janeiro, what followed was an eerie silence, as the man who had spent his entire life cheating death had seemingly finally had his time. Between fighting in both world wars, including the First Battle of Somme, and earning medals for bravery each time, to setting world records for exploration and mountain climbing, until he eventually became a world-class celestial navigator. And it's safe to say Harold William Tillman was truly an extraordinary man with a death wish. While you might wonder what would drive a man to spend the entirety of his life on these types of excursions, in a few remarks about the war after the fact, he stated that he was often questioning why he was the one who had survived. And as a result of not wanting to be left alone with his thoughts, he could never fully adjust to a mundane life. As a result, this led to Tillman being a part of some of the earliest recon trips to the Himalayas for mountaineering. And for a time, he even held the world record for the tallest mountain summited, that being Nanda Devi in the 1930s. Additionally, he is even responsible for scouting the route that would later become the standard approach for Everest. And that all being said, the Mount Heard expedition was just a final footnote on his extensive list of achievements. And had it not been for the Patinella, this world achievement would have likely never occurred. Because even for a man as fearless as Tillman, even he knew better than to take his ship Mischief on the journey. And when he asked if Patinella was a worthy vessel, he immediately reconsidered. For just like Harold Tillman had cheated death, the Patinella had also gained a reputation for cheating death as well. In 1954, the vessel had also been used for crayfishing, and on one particular day, the boat got into a bit of trouble and ended up gashing a major hole in its hull. Now, this boat had been equipped with a watertight bulkhead, which in turn managed to confine the water to only a certain part of the hull, preventing it from sinking. Miraculously, the boat had managed to make it back to the port unaided after spending 14 hours at sea. As a result of the globe. Thus, this ended up making the Patinella a piece of history, not only for this world first, but also in Harold Tillman's often forgotten legacy. But unbeknownst to everyone at the time, the Patinella would later come to have another thing in common with Harold Tillman over 24 years later. Now, as time would progress, the Patinella would seemingly not be able to continue a mundane life either, as the boat had continued to pop up in newspapers over the years. In the 1970s, a man by the name of Norm Hunt had his own set of adventures with the Patinella, where in a around-the-world journey, he had eventually been iced in unscathed. Additionally, on another voyage to Kenya during this time, the ship had been left unattended for less than half of an hour. After they returned back to the ship, they had found that the ship had been ransacked. And while it's definitely surprising just how many times this tiny ship had made headlines, we're really only getting started going into the 80s. Because that's when the story of the Patinella would really take a bizarre turn. That being in 1988, when after being passed down from owner to owner, the ship had eventually been purchased by a wealthy businessman from Perth by the name of Alan Nicol. At the time, the ship was valued at about $500,000.
And after being purchased, this is when Patinella's final known journey would begin. On the 16th of October 1988, the goal was a month-long voyage where they were to set out from Fremantle Harbour for Airlie Beach in Australia, where Nicol planned to vacation in the Whitsundays with his wife and their 2 children. The boat was also scheduled to work as a charter vessel thereafter. As the journey began, the boat had a crew of 6. On board was the schooner's owner, who we already discussed, his skipper, Ken Jones, a 52-year-old distinguished sailor, his wife, Noreen Jones, their daughter, Rona Lee Jones, and 2 young sailors, 23-year-old John Blissett and 21-year-old Michael Calvin. Blissett and Calvin were new to the boat, and they first started working for Alan after they both started their navigational certificates. Additionally, they agreed that they could work as crewmen for the boat's charter business when they arrived at Airlie Beach. As a result, Nicol hired them. And as the first portion of the journey began, it was all smooth sailing. But on October 29th, both Rona Lee Jones and Alan Nicol had got off the boat at Port Lincoln for other work-related commitments. This is only temporary for Alan though, and he planned on getting back on the boat in Sydney on November 8th, where he would get back on the boat and continue to Airlie Beach to meet his family. But little did Alan and Rona Lee know that at the time they were getting off the boat at Port Lincoln, it would be the last time they saw Patinella ever again. As a result, this left 4 people on board: Ken Jones, his wife Noreen, and the 2 new crewmen, John Blissett and Michael Calvin. A few days after Alan was dropped off, on November 4th, Alan received a radio call from his skipper who claimed the boat was docked in Portland and that they needed money for fuel. While the money was later wired to Ken, he later withdrew it, but it's unclear if he actually purchased fuel that day. The next day, on November 5th, Michael Calvin's father had received a surprise call from his son. On the line, he said, "G'day, Dad," but after this, the line went dead. On that same day, Jones radioed Wilson's Promontory, where he gave a positional update. He would do the same thing on November 6th as they passed Bega. On November 7th, Patinella was spotted by a lighthouse keeper at Point Perpendicular. And as the sun set on the 7th and led into the 8th, at 1 a.m., a radio operator at Overseas Telecommunication Commission received a call from Ken Jones. He stated that Patinella was currently 10 nautical miles east from Botany Bay in Sydney. He would go on to say, "I believe we've run out of fuel. We've hoisted our sails, and we're tacking out to the east, tacking out about 080. Our intention is to tack out for a couple hours, then tack back in. We may need some assistance in the morning to get back into Sydney Harbor." Now, this transmission was noted to be odd by the family members for a couple of reasons. For one, Ken Jones' son had this to say after he listened to it. "It's certainly my father's voice in the tape, but it doesn't seem to be his words. I don't think he'd ever say he believed that he was out of fuel. He was too experienced to be so vague. I think his radio calls were veiled calls for help." Additionally, Alan Nicol stated that the Patinella would not have been short of fuel, as the 3,500-liter fuel tanks were filled to capacity at the start of the voyage, and additional diesel had been added at stops along the way. But the oddities don't end there. About an hour later, Ken called back and requested directions to the town of Maruya, which was 300 km on the line, and the only words that could be deciphered were 300 kilometers south? Is it south? This would be the last known communication from Patinella. Assuming they ran into trouble at night while sailing, it's worth pointing out that the boat had been equipped with an emergency position indicating radio beacon. Had some issue occurred on board, they would have been able to send a distress frequency to any passing aircraft overhead for 48 hours. Now, these beacons can either be activated manually or automatically if submerged in water, but no such signal seems to have been sent. Despite Ken failing to arrive at Sydney the next morning on the 8th, Nicol didn't report the boat missing. But I should clarify that he did not know about the transmission from the night before. And whatever reasoning Ken had for asking for directions to Maruya, that remains unclear. After the Patinella's last correspondence, it wouldn't be until 11 days later that the boat was actually reported missing. That was when the Patinella had failed to reach Airlie Beach on the 18th. At that time, Peter Jones, the son of the skipper, attempted to reach his father on that day. After multiple attempts to reach his father, he subsequently went to the authorities. But the authorities refused to launch a full-scale search. The Patinella case was plunged into controversy when the Federal Sea Safety and Surveillance Center in Canberra refused to launch a full-scale search for the yacht. The center said it had been notified 11 days after the yacht went missing, and that any proper search would have to cover an impossible 200,000 square kilometers of ocean. Now, after a 3-year investigation from the Australian government, they later declared in 1992 that the boat had simply sunk on that same night that they radioed into Botany Bay. Now, despite this conclusion, they never elaborated on how the boat's investigation instead proposed that the boat was hit by another large freighter, and not reported for some reason. This was despite all other 48 vessels in the area that night having been checked for damage to their hull. None of them showed any damage. And it's worth mentioning that the boat was spotted multiple times after this night. Now, the investigation went on to claim that none of these sightings were ever confirmed. But that being said, some 6 months after the boat had disappeared, on May 9th of 1989, fishermen off the coast of Terrigal, about 30 miles north of Sydney, discovered a barnacle-covered buoy. After the fisherman retrieved it out of the water, he found that it bore the name Patinella. Now, this buoy was later sent to Sydney University for testing. Marine biologists there concluded that the buoy's growth of barnacles had determined that the buoy had been drifting for no more than 4 weeks, suggesting that the boat was still afloat some months later. But in various other retellings of the stories by officials working on this case, they disregard the 1-month claim and state the following. A life buoy identified as being from the Patinella was recovered from the Sea of Terrigal, New South Wales on the 9th of May, 1989. Marine growth adhering to over this evidence in the investigation, predominantly on the note of the fisherman who had retrieved it out of the water, as he had rinsed off a portion of it to read the word Patinella. But based on the statements made in news reports at the time, marine biologists were also able to determine that the specific type of marine life found present on the life ring was specific to the Coral Sea, where they speculated that the life ring had drifted from a point near Cooktown, Australia. On top of that, the boat had been spotted at Rockingham Bay in March and at Fraser Island on June 9th. And interestingly enough, on June 3rd, an unidentified body had been found washed up on Manly Beach, 25 miles from where the buoy was. The body that washed up on Manly Beach was 175 to 180 centimeters tall. It was believed to be a man between the ages of 20 and 30. However, the body had been so badly decomposed that the person was completely unidentifiable. Additionally, the man was believed to have had a slim build, and when they found him, he only had one leg remaining, with one of his shoes a rough approximation. Because when it comes to estimating a body's decomposition at sea, that's not something that we generally have a lot of data on, pointed to things like water oxygen levels being a factor. And to elaborate a bit further on what I'm talking about here, one obvious variable that needs to be factored in is ocean scavengers. Things like sharks, crabs, and small fish will tend to pick apart a body pretty quickly. Depending on the animal activity, there can be a pretty drastic variance in a body's decomposition. And just recently, in another study on body decomposition, scientists found that scavengers would have selective preferences on bodies depending on the dissolved oxygen levels in the water. Additionally, another thing that is very common in bodies retrieved from shipwrecks or diving accidents and other maritime incidents is this thing called adipocere or grave wax. Essentially, adipocere is an incredibly persistent substance that forms from the decomposition of fat cells, ultimately leading to a preservational effect on the body. For example, in 2011, after a couple nearby earthquakes in Switzerland, a body was found floating in Lake Brienz. The investigation estimated that the body was as fresh as 6 months old, but as it turned out, adipocere ended up creating a massive cocoon on the torso of the body, and x-rays later showed that it preserved much of the internal portions of the man, including his heart, stomach, and other structures. They later examined cherry pits found in his stomach, as well as some bone collagen from the cadaver. After further analysis, radiocarbon dating placed the man's death at 300 years. But that being said, adipocere development isn't fully understood. And to quote this paper from the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine, while several studies have been performed on the nature, the formation, and the degradation of adipocere, there's still no reliable model to assess the post-mortem interval of a body exhibiting it. But to put it simply, the ocean is still a mystery in many ways, and it's difficult to take this 4-week figure at face value without any kind of reasoning. Given this detail, who's to say that it wasn't 7 weeks to match the time frame of the buoy, or 7 months to match one of the missing crew members, Michael Calvin, and as such, police requested his dental records. Presumably, it wasn't a match though. I say presumably because there seems to be no further statement given on the matter. And besides a couple articles in local newspapers at the time, there isn't a single mention of this body in any other literature on this case. And when I say there's not a single mention of this body later on, not in regards to this case or any other case either. Searching for further information about a body that washed up at this particular location and time only ever yields these details. And given the findings of the marine biologists and the sightings that placed the Patinella in the area, all of these details seem to suggest that the Patinella was still afloat, perhaps hijacked with a new crew. Considering the aforementioned and assuming the two things were connected, it seems that one theory that could be proposed here was that there was some other emergency on the Patinella, ultimately leading to the deployment of the life buoy. One thing that seems to suggest this was a statement given by Alan Nickel at the time. When asked about the life ring, he stated that this wasn't just some object that would have fallen off the boat. It was located in a position that required manual detachment. But all that being said, there's also a chance that this body is perhaps related to something else entirely. But as far as the official record goes, whoever washed up on Manly Beach June 3rd, 1989, that remains unknown. Now, as the investigation continued, more and more sightings continued to occur across the globe, with the most common being along the Australian coast. Additionally, several other sightings were reported around Thailand and Southeast Asia, and one sighting even made it as far as South America. And all things considered, despite no distress signal being sent from the Patinella, with no debris of any kind being found, with no damage to any other boats in the area, the Australian investigation still concluded that the boat had to have sank on the same night in Botany Bay. And not only did they conclude this with a lack of evidence, they concluded this while dismissing other valid evidence at the time. Instead of addressing the marine biologist's findings, they were later misrepresented at a later date without any kind of clarification. And don't even get me started on that body, which is such an obscure detail it is yet to reach the light of day in any other discussion of this case. To put it simply, you'd think that if they were so certain the Patinella had sunk on the same night without any kind of hijacking or other crime taking place, the Australian investigation could prove it by searching a very specific area 10 miles off the coastline. But as far as I'm aware, no attempt was made to prove the investigation's theory. And to put it simply, the hit-and-run theory they proposed was a stretch, and I haven't even brought up the fact that the Patinella had received $40,000 worth of upgrades after going under new ownership. Included in those upgrades was a new radar system that would alert them to any nearby vessels, which would have made it next to impossible that they could have been a victim of a hit-and-run. Even if we factor in any kind of other disaster occurring on that same night, the fact that no debris was found the next morning leaves you with no reason to believe the boat had sank the night before. So all in all, a highly durable ship capable of sailing to any place on the planet, known for facing some of the world's toughest conditions, persevering through icebergs for days on end, that had just been upgraded with some of the best navigation and safety equipment money could buy, simply sank without any evidence, and the case was closed according to the professionals. Naturally, you have to ask what the hell was going on with this investigation. And to take a closer look at how the investigation ran its course, let's begin with Alan Nickel's actions after the Patinella disappeared. If you recall, Mr. Alan Nickel never reported the boat missing. This detail is incredibly strange. Alan was due to be picked up on the 8th, but for some reason, he presumed that they had continued on without him. Despite some 11 days passing with no further correspondence, this still wasn't enough for him to say anything. and this makes it appear that perhaps some factor was preventing Nickel from going to the authorities. It's possible, but it's also possible that Nickel was also distracted by his day-to-day. Regardless of this strange detail, Nickel definitely seemed concerned about the spend of some $30,000, where he basically financed his own investigation and went to great lengths to interview people who had seen the ship. And most notably, after the Patinella had disappeared, he had made several allegations to Western Australian police. To start his list of suspicions, he suspected the skipper to have played some role in hijacking the boat based on previous business failures. But no further elaboration is given on this detail in later reports. The only thing that does even slightly seem to suggest this possibility was the final transmission. Ken Jones randomly asking for directions to Maria, that does definitely seem to point to some suspicious behavior. But it's also plausible that Ken could have been acting under duress, and like Ken Jones' son said, perhaps his final conversation was in fact a thinly veiled call for help. Now perhaps the most, but he was ripped off. And while the police investigated this point, I couldn't find any other details that would corroborate this at all. Getting back to the crew though, further allegations were made at John Blissett and Michael Calvin. This one seemed to be a bit more plausible though. In hindsight, he didn't know them very well. They were the only variable for this trip, and it also seemed suspicious that the two boys apparently admired the Patinella so much, it led them to ask for a job on the boat. At the time this case was being investigated, it definitely seemed plausible, but some 2 decades later, on New Year's Day 2008, a woman combing a secluded beach near the town of Eucla had found a message in a bottle from John Blissett. It was dated October 26, 1988. It read, "Hi there, out there on the lonely Southern Ocean, and thought we would give away a free holiday in the Whitsunday Islands in North Queensland, Australia. Our ship is traveling from Fremantle, Western Australia, to Queensland to work as a charter vessel." It gave the Patinella's position as 34 degrees to the call to claim their prize, and he signed off saying, "See you soon, Jono." Now, ultimately, this note seems to suggest that the two boys were interested in going on an adventure, as this entire thing seems incredibly lighthearted. Presuming that they planned on doing something malicious in the coming days, this seems completely out of character. Now, moving on to the final allegation made by Nickel. That was that he suspected that the boat was hijacked by persons involved with trafficking narcotics. Based on his own investigation, which led him to interviewing various people who had spotted the ship, he had learned that the boat wouldn't stop into town for fuel or supplies. The ship was almost exclusively spotted around open water, and on the rare occasion that Patinella did dock into shore, it would only go to remote areas that were accessible by four-wheel drive vehicles. If we consider the strange behavior from Ken that night, with no emergency transmission, along with the later sightings of the boat placing it in Thailand, this theory, while reliant on eyewitness testimony, does seem to have some plausibility. While it is worth noting that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, the Patinella was in Thailand were true, this would have placed the boat along a known trafficking route out of the Golden Triangle. Additionally, had this been the case, this could also account for the buoy drifting from some remote part in the Coral Sea. Additionally, the boat would have been refitted to disguise its look and then re-registered in a different country by bribing separate officials. On top of all of that, given the nature of what business we would be potentially dealing with this case, this can also account for some potential corruption in the investigation, which could explain the poor conclusion given by the investigation. But getting back to that investigation, let's take another look at how that all went down. Because after Nickel raised suspicions about a further crime and reported his allegations, from here there was apparently some internal struggle over who was responsible for the case, and as a result of bureaucratic issues, no work was done on this case for months. The investigation was later escalated from the federal C9. They finally assigned Detective Superintendent Ed Tyree to be in charge of the case, with him being an advisor to who had the final say in the case, that being the state coroner Derek Hand. Now, in Australia, the coroner's role is a bit different. It's not a medical position. Instead, it's an appointed judicial officer with the legal job to investigate the cause of deaths reported to them. And it just so happens that this isn't one of his cases from this time. A case that has some similar circumstances to what we're talking about. That being the case of Robbie Joe Coulter, a 17-year-old teen who lived in Mildura. After Robbie had left a New Year's party in the early hours of the morning, he had last been seen walking along the side of a road. He never made it back that night. 2 days later, on January 3rd, 1989, Robbie's body would be found in a nearby river. His body had been weighed down with 21-kilogram mill bricks. His hands were found bound behind his back with bolts to secure them. According to local news reports at the time, Rob and stepfather Linton Coulter revealed Robbie Joe had told him he feared narcotics dealers were out to get him after he had witnessed a drug drop 2 months earlier. And do you want to know what Derek Hand had to say about this particular case? He stated that he was, quote, quite satisfied that Coulter was not murdered. To add insult to injury, Mr. Derek Hand ruled that Robbie had taken his own life instead. Another unpopular theory, with one publication stating the entirety of the police working alongside Mr. Derek Hand, as the police instead discredited the elephant in the room and insisted that there was some practical joke that could have gone wrong. Once again, they had no evidence to suggest this. Reportedly, the party was not a wild one. Robbie wasn't intoxicated. And additionally, it appeared that Robbie had made it back to his apartment thereafter. I should go on to state Robbie's family has been waiting 30 years for answers on this particular case. They had been asking every single year for the case to be reopened. And all that being considered, the same person who was responsible for this case is the same person who had the final say in the Patinella case. Now, it just so happens that Ed Tyree later found nothing and claimed these allegations made by Nickel were without apparent substance. He would later go on to give the statement, inquiries into various allegations insinuating that Patinella was afloat and involved in criminal activities are unable to be substantiated. As far as to suggest that he had reported criminal suspicions as a way of dealing with, quote, perceived inactivity on the part of various agencies, both Commonwealth and state, to search for the Patinella. Now, ultimately, Ed Tyree and Derek Hand's investigation led to this hit-and-run theory, which makes absolutely no sense. But I should mention that not all of the members of the AFP had the same opinions. And when the life buoy was found, another detective superintendent by the name of Dave Lewington of the AFP National Criminal Investigation Branch, he went on to say the buoy supported the theory that a crime had been committed on the boat. He cited the findings of the marine biologists and a recent oceanographic report which had confirmed to him that prevailing currents at the time meant the life ring had to have floated from somewhere in the Coral Sea, not the Tasman Sea. And perhaps the most jarring thing about this investigation was the absolute slap in the face to the families after the fact. The detective working on this case was commended on his work in this investigation by the state coroner, Mr. Derek Hand. Think about that for a second. Derek Hand complimented his detective on finding nothing. Now, if I had to summarize this case, nearly every detail given in news reports at the time seems to conflict with the final statements given by the officials in charge of the investigation. And if you're wondering where I got these final statements, these all come from the Australian Federal Police's own publication in an article on the Patinella. While you might expect the most detail to come from an article written by the actual investigation, it was actually the least helpful and perhaps the most vague in regards to this case. And based on referencing every little piece of literature, 4 people disappeared. Additionally, their reluctance continued after multiple sightings were made. The investigation never attempted to prove the boat's final resting place, despite claiming it was only 10 miles offshore from a major city. The investigation's conclusion contradicts multiple pieces of scientific evidence without any clarification, so much so that comments by their peers at the time have blatant contradictions. The investigation accused a victim of making false accusations, claiming he didn't actually believe them. But from other sources, we learn he spent $30,000 of his own money to search for the boat. The investigation claimed that every single sighting of the world-famous bright yellow ship was not verifiable. But when you dig up some of the news reports at the time, the sightings not only match certain time frames of other key details, they also seem to have a specific behavior, as Nickel noted, that washed up within close proximity and time frame to the only known piece of Patinella. While one police spokesman stated that nothing had indicated that it could have been a crewman from Patinella, their actions were completely contradictory, as it was reported that they had requested these specific records only. And with the results in a situation where two corrupt individuals are conspiring together, that a coroner would praise a detective for being so persistent at finding nothing. Questionable investigation aside though, wherever the Patinella is today, or what exactly happened to the crew, they are both still mystical. Have a good day.
Big thank you to Nebula for sponsoring this video. It is August 8th, 2001. President George W. Bush is about to give his first ever nationally, so far the biggest issues of his presidency in Texas.
Good evening. That is one of the most profound of our time. The issue of research involving stem cells derived from human embryos is increasingly the subject of a national debate and dinner table discussions. My administration must decide whether to allow federal funds, your tax dollars, as do most Americans. We recoil at the idea of growing human beings for spare body parts or creating life for our convenience. And while we must devote enormous energy to conquering disease, it is equally important that we pay attention to the moral concerns raised by the new frontier of human embryo stem cell research. Even the most noble ends do not justify any means.
Awaken to a world of wonder in Final Fantasy XIV Online.
And just like that, the White House issued an executive order to ban federal funding for new embryonic stem cells. It was a decision that would almost immediately kill all US momentum in the field. And in Congress, a battle was raging on whether they should ban the practice entirely. If not for the events of September 2001, the stem cell issue may have gone on to become one of the defining political controversies of the Bush Jr. years. And it was all kicked off by the Roslin Institute in Scotland, although she wasn't announced to the world until February of 1997. At which point she was about 7 months old. Dolly is also a Finn Dorset sheep, and her birth resulted in more laws being passed than perhaps anyone else in history. You see, Dolly is a clone, an exact genetic copy. Your body is made up of cells, trillions of blobs that make up your muscles, your bones, your organs. Inside those little blobs are a bunch of chemical gizmos, let's say. The most important gizmo is the nucleus, the brain of the cell. Inside the nucleus is a full copy of your genetics, your DNA. It's an acronym that definitely stands for something, but you don't really need to know what. DNA is essentially a gigantic instruction list in the shape of a double helix. And in that double helix are a bunch of molecular pairs, A and T, or C and G. It's one or the other. We call this a base pair. Humans have approximately 3 billion base pairs, and the precise order of all those A's, T's, C's, and G's determines stuff like your hair color, eye color, how tall you are, whether cilantro tastes like soap, over 20,000 different genes. Now when two animals reproduce, most of the time it goes like this. 50% of the DNA is contributed from a sperm cell and 50% from an egg cell. The DNA combines and you get a new full set of DNA that's a combo of both parents. That single cell then multiplies, going from 2 to 4, 8, until it can potentially become a full organism. Now the crazy part is that 99.9% of your DNA is shared with every other human. And you and your parents, the closest genetic match most people will ever have, share 50% of that very last 0.1%. That last decimal point is what separates you from everyone else. The exception to that would be a clone. Like I mentioned earlier, Dolly had 3 moms. One mom provided the egg cell, with its DNA removed via a small needle, leaving behind an empty container. The second mom provided a nucleus, with a full 100% copy of its DNA. That nucleus was inserted into the empty egg cell, which was then stimulated with electricity to artificially kickstart cell duplication. Then, pretty much the same as before, that cell multiplied, 2, 4, 8, until it was stable enough to become implanted into the womb of the third mom, a surrogate. The third mom was pregnant for the usual 5 months, and then she gave birth to Dolly, that became a global news sensation. A living, breathing clone that you could visit and pet. A marvel of human ingenuity, like something out of science fiction. Except, Dolly was not the first ever clone. In fact, she's not even the first cloned sheep. Humans have been cloning plants for literally thousands of years. And when it comes to animals, the first ever cloned tadpoles were made in the 1950s. So why was Dolly so special? Why now? It's because Dolly was the first ever clone from an adult cell, not an embryo. And that had huge ramifications for medicine. Human medicine. The cells in your body have specific functions. Bone cells are rigid and provide structure. Muscle cells are flexible and allow for movement. Nerve cells send electrical signals, connecting your brain and the rest of your body. But Dolly's existence proved that any adult cell has all the necessary genetic information stored in their little nucleus to revert back to an embryonic state. A state where all possible cells are part of a vast, branching tree of potential. And at the bottom of that tree, the stem is the embryonic stem cell. Stem cells are a uniquely potent cell that has the remarkable ability to repair our bodies. Think of the Pokemon Eevee, a generic base template that can be molded into any type with the right environment and stimulus. With stem cells, you can create bone marrow cells to treat leukemia. With stem cells, you could create pancreatic cells to produce insulin for diabetics. With stem cells, maybe you could even grow someone a new kidney. Medicine at the turn of the was how do we do this responsibly? There are 2 types of cloning, reproductive cloning and therapeutic cloning. The first is what Dolly is, a way to make copies of full organisms. Therapeutic cloning is smaller in scope, a way to make copies of genes, tissues, maybe even full organs, with the goal of treating or preventing disease. One of these was broadly unpopular, especially when it came to humans. The majority of scientists agreed it was too risky, too morally dubious to try and clone a human child. Nearly every major world leader expressed their desire for a ban on cloning humans, including Bill Clinton. Therapeutic clone acquired human embryos, that made it a deeply politicized topic, and the Bush White House intervened. And American scientists had strong opinions on this. I think there is every reason to believe that if passed, this kind of prohibition would not be effective. I think that thousands of years of human experience have shown us that governments cannot bottle up human progress, even when you want to. We will be sitting here with the best scientists in the world watching things on television. In his speeches, Bush evoked worst-case scenarios that included organ farms, made-to-order children, and desperate women pressured into selling their eggs. But his critics argued the opposite. The best way to control the research is to fund it by the federal government, because then you create rules. This is true. Even without Bush's ban, the FDA was already regulating cloning techniques. As soon as any researcher so much as touches a human egg cell, there's a paper trail and dozens of eyes on them. By opting for an outright ban instead of regulating it, Bush was ensuring one thing. People are still going to do it. They're just going to go to different countries. And that is where our story takes us. In July 1997, a few months after Dolly was revealed to the world, Thailand devalued its currency. The 1990s had seen several East Asian countries rapidly industrialize and expand their economies with absurd growth rates that seemed far too good to be true. But as 1997 came around, global exports slowed, particularly in the semiconductor market, and foreign investors saw blood in the water. That year, Thailand's stock market completely tanked, and the crash initiated a cascade that brought down the economies of several nearby nations. Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, all were hit with recessions. Indonesia even forced its president to resign. But our story truly begins in South Korea, which was finally feeling the shockwaves by October 1997. Although the exact mechanics of the crisis are a bit beyond our scope here, South Korea's economy was by and large dominated by massive corporations known as chaebols, brands like Hyundai, LG, and Samsung, behemoths that were seen as too big to fail, at least until they weren't. They'd been taking on aggressive and risky foreign loans, expecting the government to be their safety net, but something had to give. Before the crisis, South Korea had 7 major automobile companies. Only 2 emerged from the crisis unscathed. By 1999, of the top 30 chaebols, 11 of them had gone into bankruptcy or bankruptcy protection. Included in that number was the Daewoo conglomerate, which at the time was the largest corporate bankruptcy in history. By 1998, 1.5 million South Koreans lost their jobs. All in all, it was a terrible way to be ending the 90s for a nation that had suffered so much in the last century. The first half of the 20th century saw Korea brutally colonized by the Japanese, only to then be further occupied by the Americans, leading to a devastating war that divided the country permanently in two. What followed in the South was decades of military dictatorships, political unrest, and now an economic crisis that was undoing the last decade of relative stability. To put it simply, things were bad, and the timing of the incumbent party ousted by a slim margin. The incoming president was longtime neoliberal candidate Kim Dae-jung, and a priority of his administration was to figure out how to make South Korea a major player on the global economic stage, so this could never happen again. It didn't help that the country was being crowded out by 2 of its next-door neighbors. To the east, you had Japan, which had a clear edge when it came to award-winning scientific research and consumer electronics. And to the west, you had China, which was undergoing unprecedented population growth and was well on its way to becoming the cheap manufacturing hub of the entire world. During the 90s, the South Korean government had found some success by making significant investments in semiconductors and IT, but that alone had not been enough to shield them from the crisis of 97. No, it needed something else. A cutting-edge technological niche, one that the government could devote millions. The government looked at Dolly and said, "We can do that." But it wasn't enough to just throw millions of dollars at biotech research in general. South Korea had already been doing that since the 80s. They were up against Japan, China, as well as the Western powers like the US and the UK. They would never win in a battle of who can spend the most money. They needed something more than that. With their limited funds, they crafted a strategy to support a select number of star scientists to elevate them as symbols of national pride, to inspire hope. Economic growth is one thing. GDP, inflation, unemployment rates, that's all well and good. But statistics and acronyms aren't tangible to the average person. Koreans needed someone to latch onto, whose research would make headlines in the newspapers, whose face they would come to recognize on TV. They needed a celebrity. The idea of a national celebrity scientist is not a concept unique to South Korea. All around the world, we often think of science in terms of iconic individuals, lone geniuses, visionaries. We'll often see a project with hundreds, if not thousands of researchers and boil it down to the lone face in charge, a single person who we project our own national values onto. Within the realm of biotech, this was already happening. Around the turn of the new millennium, the Human Genome Project was nearing its end goal, a decades-long task to write down all 3 billion base pairs found in 2 Western nations, each of which had their own mascot. As the Daily Mail pointed out at the time, in the British corner, devoted in earnest, is John Sulston, 57, who drives a second-hand car and wears battered leather sandals. Surging out on the US side is Craig Venter, 54, a former surf bum who now has a gold Rolex on his wrist and a 70,000-pound yacht called Sorcerer as just one of his toys. Both men appealed to an archetype of what each country viewed as a model scientist, the bold American entrepreneur versus the reserved British intellectual. So who could be that national archetype for South Korea? What scientists should the government pluck from obscurity to lead them into the new millennium? The man they chose was almost too perfect to believe. Huang Woo-suk is a man whose life story feels almost manufactured. Just 1 year after the first ever tadpole was cloned, Huang Woo-suk was born. It's 1953, half a year before the armistice that would put an official end to the Korean War. Huang's family was poor, with his mom tend to his siblings and their 3 cattle. When there wasn't enough food, he resorted to eating tree bark. Even from such a young age though, Huang says he dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Out of his entire elementary school class, Huang was the only student to receive a higher education. In high school, he was ranked just 400th out of 480 students. He had to work on a farm to just barely afford his tuition. Eventually though, he worked his way up from the bottom and got accepted to Seoul National University, SNU, to become a veterinarian. From humble beginnings to the most prestigious university in the entire country. He would graduate with a PhD in 1982, with a specialization in theriogenology, aka the study of animal reproduction. Given what he would later become